hello, welcome. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us today for this GMF virtual event on the US midterm elections and its implications for transatlantic allies. I'm Martin Quencez, I'm the director of the Paris office of the German Marshall Fund. Very happy to be here to moderate this conversation with my two colleagues. This is a topic very much at the core of the GMF mission, because we will discuss the articulation of domestic politics and foreign policy with the transatlantic angle. So very much what GMF is meant to be as a platform of discussion. And we have this event today in partnership with the Canadian Embassy in Paris, a longtime partner of the German Marshall Fund Paris office, and I thank them again for their help and cooperation. We are now 1 week exactly, actually, after the midterms on November 8th. We still don't have a full picture, or at least a comprehensive picture in both the House and the Senate, but we already know quite a lot on both sides. And what we can say is that it is somewhat of a surprise. Some of the results came as sort of a shock to some observers and analysts, and we will see together what are the main lessons learned, what kind of conclusions can be drawn by the two parties at the domestic and foreign policy level. And obviously, the new majority or the new Congress will influence the next 2 years of the Biden administration, and the ability of President Biden to weigh on the international stage and play a leadership role also within the transatlantic relationship. And this is very much what we want to discuss today. I have a great pleasure to have two great speakers to discuss this. Bailey Childers, who is in DC at the German Marshall Fund in DC, the Director of Government Relations, and she will look more specifically at the domestic level. You have Bailey's full bio in the invitation, but I should say that Bailey has an extensive expertise on everything that has to do with the Hill, and so we'll have a chance to discuss the politics behind the results and what it means also for the 2024 presidential elections in the US. And then I will then turn to Roland Paris, who is a professor and director of Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Roland is a regular commentators and participants in GMF events. Thank you very much for joining us again. And he has, well, a long series of experiences, both in the academic sector, expertise, think tank, but also as the senior advisor for foreign policy for Prime Minister Trudeau. In terms of the format, I will give you all both maybe 8-9 minutes for kickoff remarks, and then we'll have a chance to take questions. So to all of you, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to write your questions, and we'll pick some of them and I'll direct them directly to the speakers. We'll have an informal conversation. We have about 55 minutes left. I should mention that this is on the record. And without further ado, I'll turn now to Bailey to look at the domestic front. Bailey, here you go.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. So what I want to do in the time I have to kick off is talk about where we stand right now with the US elections, talk about some of the major narratives coming out of the 2022 elections, what to watch for the next few weeks in this kind of lamed up Congress and what's next for Congress, and touch on what all of this means for 2024. And then happy to take questions after our opening. So where we stand in the Senate with the wins by the incumbent senators in Nevada and Arizona over the weekend, we do know now that Democrats will hold the US Senate. The Georgia runoff is scheduled for December 6th, and what that's going to determine is whether Democrats have a 50 or a 51 seat majority. Now that matters because the way the committee structure in the Senate works, when you're moving judges and nominations, for example, if you're in a 50-50 committee and the nominee deadlocks, it takes an extra step to move that person to the floor of the Senate. So if Democrats win the Georgia runoff, and have 51 seats, it just means there'll be a little bit less gridlock moving some of their nominations, judges, and other policies through, because you won't have that extra discharge step for people who tie. So there is some significant meaning to whether or not you have 50 or 51 seats, but regardless, the Democrats will hold the Senate. Republicans are very close to securing a majority in the House. I think it'll be a slim majority, but they will win the House most likely. It's not completely done yet, but I think they're getting very close. So maybe just a matter of another few more days here until we see that. So we will likely have split government on the House and Senate. And so, you know, looking at 2022, as Martin mentioned, I think a lot of people were surprised. You know, there was an expectation there would be what we call a red wave that did not materialize. So I wanted to talk about a couple of reasons why, though obviously we'll love to, when we have discussions, see what other people are thinking. So in the exit polls from last Tuesday, the top two issues for voters were inflation and abortion. And so even though, you know, a lot of people weren't happy with pocketbook issues, abortion did make it to the #2 slot, which I think says a lot about what was driving some of the turnout and some of how people voted on election night. We also know that young voters perform very well for the Democrats. The estimates from the exit polls there are that 27% of people in the 18 to 29 age category voted, and of that age group, 63% supported Democrats. And that turnout is only second to 2018. So that's higher than normal from those exit polls, though again, there's still a lot of data to go through as we get final results and kind of dig into the young voters, but that's definitely something that came out of last week. There was also a rejection of extreme election denier candidates. So you really saw this at the gubernatorial level, for example. So in Pennsylvania, Arizona, which was actually, that governor's race was just called last night, the two election denier candidates lost. You also saw gubernatorial flips from a Republican to a Democratic governor in places like Maryland and Massachusetts, where again, the Republican candidate was a Trump election denier candidate. And so you really saw a rejection of those type of candidates among voters. The other key rate level I'll mention is the Secretary of State, where in key battleground states, the election deniers lost all of those races for Secretary of State. So while voters may have been unhappy with inflation, as you know, again, that was their top issue, and overall disapprove of the president, his approval ratings are quite low. They didn't like the alternative they were given in a lot of places. And so, you know, that I think is my main takeaway from Tuesday is, although they're unhappy with what they have currently, they weren't given a solution that they liked better. So what to watch as we go into the new Congress? I think one thing I'll flag for you all, definitely keep an eye on the dynamics between the Freedom Caucus and likely to be Speaker McCarthy. So the Republicans are holding their House leadership elections today. Leader McCarthy, currently leader, only needs a majority vote to become, you know, their nominee for speaker, but he's going to need 218 votes in January to officially become speaker. Now, the Freedom Caucus so far, which is the far right in the House, has already made a lot of demands to rule changes that they would like to see in order to support Leader McCarthy for his speakership. Interestingly, Andy Biggs from Arizona has announced he is going to challenge the speaker in that vote today. So McCarthy's not going to get 218 votes in that speaker vote today. The question is, you know, how many does he get? Does it weaken him enough that he doesn't get to be made speaker? What kind of concessions does he have to make to the Freedom Caucus to actually become speaker? So all of that will continue to play out on the Republican side in the House, which will be interesting to watch here as we move toward the new Congress. On the Democratic side, there are going to be pretty interesting dynamics there as well. Again, since the House hasn't been called, it's kind of pushed back decisions of Speaker Pelosi on what she's going to do. You know, she had said that this would be her last term as speaker, but she has not said yet what she's doing. And so depending on what she decides, there will be some interesting changes potentially in the Democratic Party as well. So that's another thing to watch. And those, the Democratic leadership elections in the House are set for November 30th. The other thing to look at in the House, especially, will be the challenge of governing, you know, so investigations and oversight, that's something that Republicans talked a lot about coming into the election, you know, but is that really going to be enough for voters come 2024? So what's their agenda really going to shape up like beyond the investigations and oversight that they've talked about? And one thing that we're watching closely at the German Marshall Fund is what support for Ukraine will look like. And, you know, I feel okay about that. You know, Republican leadership has been pretty supportive and solid in their support for Ukraine. What I don't know is with McCarthy having such a tight margin of victory in the House, does Ukraine end up becoming an issue where a couple of people in the House say, we don't want to continue support here anymore. And because the margin is so narrow, that becomes an issue. So that's definitely a dynamic to watch on Ukraine, but also really all domestic policy. Far right folks, if they only need a handful of people to say, we're not going to vote for this unless you do the following, that can give them a lot of power. On the other hand, it can give moderates a lot of power in the same way to pull things to a more moderate direction if they want to work with Democrats. So those dynamics are going to be really fascinating to watch in Congress as it unfolds. And then I'll finish with, what does this mean for 2024? So for any of those of you that were following election night, Ron DeSantis really won the night in the press on election night. The press and a lot of Republicans have been very critical of former President Trump as far as the candidates he endorsed, feeling they were weak, feeling that they caused losses that they shouldn't have caused, some of those gubernatorial races I mentioned. Former President Trump is still expected to announce he's running for re-election or running for president again tonight. So that's going to be really fascinating to see, does an alternative like DeSantis pick up steam? Can he get reach outside of Florida where he had a resounding victory on Tuesday night? It wasn't even close. Or does some other alternative pop up, and do some Republicans who are frustrated with how things went on Tuesday start to say, like, Trump is not the way forward for us, we've got to go in a different direction? So a lot of interesting questions there to see how people are going to react, if he does in fact announce tonight, and then where things go from there. So I'll pause there. That way we have plenty of time for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Bailey. And yes, please do not hesitate to ask your questions in the Q&A function. I'll turn right away to Roland. I certainly have a couple of questions for you, Bailey, but let's hear first from Roland on the foreign policy side.
Merci, Martin and Bailey. I enjoyed your comments, and will respond a little bit to some of them. And thank you to GMF for hosting this discussion. My headline takeaway on the implications of the midterms for foreign policy is that we shouldn't expect to see any major changes, at least not until 2024, when all bets are off. It wasn't a vote about international issues. It was almost entirely domestically oriented. And what should be reassuring to US allies is that the vote took place peacefully. Of course, everyone is concerned about the condition and future of American democracy, but we got, at least in this election, what seems to have been a nice dose of relative normality, and it was refreshing and a bit of a surprise. Going forward, Biden's domestic agenda will clearly be blocked by a Republican-controlled House that will also launch investigations into a broad range of questions that will be aimed at embarrassing the president and the Democrats and setting the stage for 2024. But Biden will still have a considerable latitude in foreign affairs. And again, I don't expect a lot of change, and that applies to the U.S. position on Ukraine and on China, where the bulk of the two parties more or less see eye to eye. So just dealing quickly with each of those countries and those policy areas. On Ukraine, picking up on what Bailey said, I'm not too worried about the U.S.-Ukraine position. You'll all undoubtedly be aware that Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy warned that there would be no, quote, blank check on helping Ukraine. But then he backpedaled and he was like, no, I'm talking about normal congressional oversight. I can't believe that this was a story. So the same thing happened with the letter that some Democratic lawmakers sent to Biden. They retracted it. So it's an indication, I think, of where the center of these two parties are. But there's no question that there is bubbling skepticism in parts of the Republican Party. And depending on how the war progresses, the level of expenditure that will be continued to be required from the U.S., and it will be huge no matter what, because even if the war were to end tomorrow, you would have the task of rebuilding Ukraine, this could become more of a political issue, especially as we move closer to the 2024 elections. And I expect that there will be at least more oversight of that spending going forward. And there could be attempts by Congress to potentially to limit the scale of the spending or to apply conditions on the spending. But those are, to me, though, the most likely scenario is a continuation of strong U.S. military and financial support for Ukraine and for NATO. Joe Biden feels NATO in his bones. This is fundamental to who he is, to how he understands international affairs. So, by the way, do many Republicans, particularly in the Senate. So, and then finally on this subject, I don't expect sanctions on Russia to be lifted in the foreseeable future. On China, similarly, I think that this is an area of bipartisan agreement, the tough position, and an increasingly tougher position. I think what you'll see is some of the most outspoken China hawks in Congress gaining the controls of some key House committees, and they'll be pushing the administration to further toughen its position. Although I don't think the administration needs much pushing because it's moving in that direction anyway. Although there could be some, even tougher rhetoric coming out of the House, and if Kevin McCarthy becomes the next speaker, then he's already indicated he might do an early trip to Taiwan, which will be interesting as well. So hints of where the House Republicans may focus their attention can be gleaned from listening to them. So, for example, Mike McCall, who's going to be the likely chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, has talked about strengthening export controls on China. John Katko, the ranking member of the House Committee on Homeland Security, has talked about supply chain security and said that the CHIPS Act is a very important first step, but that's not nearly enough. Representative Kathleen McMorris Rogers, the ranking member of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, has also talked about supply chains and about TikTok as a data threat. And we've seen all of this start. What we've seen with the CHIPS Act is the very beginning. That is, I would expect that if there's areas for potential for legislation to actually pass over the next session, that this tougher legislation on China is one area where it could happen, although I'll be interested in Bailey's view on that. The U.S. could introduce screening processes more for outbound investment, set new ground rules for Chinese investment in the U.S. or both. And all of this will clearly have an impact on U.S. partners. In the Indo-Pacific region, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, Japan will be, I think, under a lot more pressure to declare which side they're on and to shield different parts of their businesses from U.S. concerns. I spoke recently to some Singaporean officials. They're really worried about this. It's true also, obviously, for U.S. transatlantic allies, we'll be seeing more pressure, I think, to line up with U.S. positions on this. And there, I think the challenge will be to convince the United States to embrace the idea of friendshoring rather than reshoring, allies first rather than just America first. And the kinds of discussions that have begun in the Trade and Technology Council, for example, between the EU and the United States, are those kinds of forums will be critical in this space, and there will be difficult diplomacy and negotiations ahead, on areas of clean energy and high technology and critical minerals and other strategic goods and services. More generally on trade, I see very little change. There's no interest in new trade agreements and new trade initiatives, serious ones in the United States on either side of the aisle. And so the national security strategy released last month said almost nothing about trade. As for, for U.S. allies, I think that means basically more of the same, which is okay news. I mean, compared to the alternative, it's good news because Biden is in power, although all Canada, European countries, every country in the world has to be concerned about being caught up in U.S. protectionism. But as I said before, all bets are off for 2024. Right now, predicting that election or even who will be the Republican nominee is just a parlor game. as Bailey said, Trump has been weakened politically, but it would be very foolish to bet against his electoral prospects, not least because so much of the Republican base seems willing to follow him anywhere, whatever he wants to do, whatever he says. So, the U.S. allies, I think, individually and collectively actually need to start gaming out right now different scenarios for 2024, including darker scenarios. That planning needs to be done. It's extremely sensitive, but it also needs to be coordinated. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Roland. A lot to think about. And I'll take a first question soon, but I wanted to ask you both a couple of things. Maybe one for Bailey. What do you think will be the main lessons for the Democratic Party if indeed, the results are better than what might have been expected? Is it likely to be read as a Biden victory? And in that sense, he will take the credit that will perhaps help him prepare for re-election in 2024? Or is this something completely distinguished from the presidential campaign and the fact that, President Biden is turning 80 this weekend, I think. And so there is this kind of open question as to whether he is the right person in 2 years from now. So maybe if you could elaborate a bit more on how this is likely to be read inside the party. Second question, maybe for you, Roland. What do you think if you actually dig into this scenario when the cost of Ukraine reconstruction is rising, the war effort continues to be, supported by Western allies, but the US, for different reasons, cannot bear that cost to the same level that it has done since February 24th. So in the coming year, you will see, probably coming from DC, increasing pressure for Europeans and Canadians and others to do more. What is the most likely response from transatlantic allies? Is there, in your view, a margin of maneuver for allies to respond to this challenge and actually say we will take some of the burden? Or are we facing a crisis where nobody will be able to compensate for the possible decrease in US support? So we'll start there, and then I'll take questions from the Q&A. Maybe first Bailey. Yeah.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. What are the takeaways for the Democrats? So it certainly, President Biden should say it's a victory for him. For any of those who kind of follow U.S. elections regularly, a midterm for a president is almost always a complete disaster for the party. So the Democrats did something that's very rare in holding the Senate. And at this point, again, the House is not called yet, but it looks like the gains there for Republicans will be a lot smaller than most people predicted and would be normal in a historical midterm election. So that certainly is a victory for the president to claim. And so then I think the question is, well, what's next? And there are still, with inflation being the #1 issue that voters identified going into the exit polls on Tuesday, and then combined with their dissatisfaction of how the president and Democrats were addressing that, that's something that the Democrats have to figure out how they're going to address between now and 2024. So continuing to deal with costs people are facing, figuring out what to do about inflation, and price of gas, price of groceries, price of childcare, all these things that are driving those concerns for Americans. They're going to have to figure that out and figure out what their messaging is going to be about that as they move into 2024. As far as what the president will do, I don't know. He said, I think it did give him breathing room. He even said himself, I think in a news report or in a news interview last week or over the weekend, that he doesn't have to rush. He's going to let people know what he'll be thinking in a few months. So, we'll see kind of what he decides. I think just predicting 2024 right now, there's just so many scenarios. It's hard to even say, but I do think he could say it's a victory. That said, there are real challenges in the American economy that voters are dealing with. And so to just rely on, well, we won this time around probably isn't a smart way to go. And I do think there is a combination of what I was talking about earlier with weak candidates on the Republican side, you don't know that you're going to be guaranteed that again in 2024. And when you start to look at the Senate landscape in 2024, that picture is very different for Democrats than it was going into this year. So the Democrats have a lot more seats to defend in the Senate in 2024. So it will be a very different election, and they've got to figure out how to address some of those gaps. Other things I think will be interesting to dig into, and there's just not enough data yet from who actually turned out last week. And again, we're not done calling all the races yet, but I am interested in the dig into young people. There is some back and forth on whether or not they did make that big of a difference. So I think that will be interesting to continue to see, were young people that much more motivated? How do you keep them so? I'm very curious where Hispanic voters went in a number of different places. And then I'll just give you one example that I think is fascinating for Democrats and Republicans to look at is Ron DeSantis split Miami-Dade in Florida. And that's the first time in a long time that that's happened, that a Republican won Miami-Dade. So I think as we start to get more and more data from last week, there's a lot to dig into to kind of figure out the story of what happened and then where we go from there.
Thank you.
Well, on your question, you asked the question about, what is the potential scenario where the U.S. basically steps back from its support for Ukraine. Let me just say before I address the scenario that I think the premise of that is really very, very unlikely. Like, I don't see the United States just kind of, at least not with this president and not necessarily with this newly elected Congress, I don't see them just walking away from Ukraine. I think where there's potential, and even this I think is less likely than more likely, there's potential for the House to start to seek to withhold some of that funding. And if that were to happen, I think that what we would see is at the beginning of talk about limits, the beginning of talk about conditions. Here's another distinction. I don't really see that affecting the weapons transfers as much as the financial transfers. So I think that all the realistic scenarios still see the United States providing a significant weapons, being the supplier of weapons to Ukraine and a very significant financial backer. And, if the United States starts pulling back, then the conditions would probably be accompanied with more pressure on U.S. allies to do more. The discourse in the U.S. would be, why are we paying so much, as it always is? And in a way, then you get a different version of your question, which is how can U.S. allies respond to U.S. pressure to be spending more? Many U.S. allies have been contributing a lot, but here's the simple answer. We will need to contribute more. And it's not just because, we need to, because burden sharing is a real thing and we want to be able to, contribute our fair share to this collective effort. It's also because we want to insulate ourselves to the greatest extent possible from more isolationist sentiments in parts of U.S. political system. I think, though, that there is a test here also for Europe. It's not just, how would the United States deal with this as this war stretches on, as it seems likely to do. A test for the EU, a test for Germany in particular. Will the ghosts of Ostpolitik, start to reassert themselves? That's, for me, a kind of equal concern. And then finally, all of this depends on what happens on the battlefield. If it becomes a World War I-like, static front lines, grinding war, and it just doesn't seem like there's much prospect for any movement, that's a very different scenario than the Ukrainian military continuing to make progress, as it seems to be doing, and the momentum seems to continue to be on its side. Some people say, oh, well, now what they're doing, what the Ukrainians have been doing is trying to gain strategic territory as much as possible before the winter sets in, get the Russians out from the west bank of the Dnieper River, which they have succeeded in doing, et cetera, so that they can have these, strategically defensible positions for the winter. I don't know. The presumption is somehow that they don't fight in the winter. Like that presumption is coming from people who don't live in winter climates. In winter, the ground is frozen and rock hard and the rivers are frozen and you don't need bridges to cross the rivers. It's a perfect time to continue offensive operations. So I think that, you know, what happens on the ground will be very interesting, and fundamentally it'll affect the debate within all of our countries about what our policy stance is towards Ukraine.
Thank you. Coming maybe back to you, Bailey, on the point that you made, but maybe you could elaborate on this. So the Republican majority of the House, if there is a majority, is very likely to be actually a very slim majority. So what would it mean concretely on the speaker, the Republican speaker, in his ability both to promote certain initiatives vis-a-vis Ukraine, but also is there perhaps a scenario in which this majority will either make it more likely or less likely for bipartisan projects to emerge? What is really the implication for bipartisanship in the US? A question for you, Roland, is if we consider that there is indeed sort of a surprisingly positive results for President Biden in these midterms election, does it open new opportunities for the transatlantic relationship? Things that we thought would not be possible, you know, when a lot of experts and observers expected a red wave. Are there things that now could be back on the table for the transatlantic partnership in the next 2 years? And you know, thinking about the second Obama mandate, a lot of the foreign policy legacy, if you think about Cuba, the JCPOA, climate agreement, happened in the second part of the mandate after the midterms, where the Congress shifted. So what do you think is likely to be Biden's foreign policy priorities in the next 2 years? And great question. I think this is going to be something that we have to watch how it evolves, and probably the leadership election this afternoon is going to give us some insight into where the different pieces of the Republican caucus are. So maybe one way to look at this, if you look at this last Congress, Speaker Pelosi has only had, you know, 4 to 5 seat margin for most of the Congress. So how she's had to manage votes is very similar to what, you know, we'll assume a Speaker McCarthy will have to do on the other side, which means you can't lose that many people. So it gives different fractions of a caucus more power if they can get enough people to say, you know, we're going to vote no on that. So maybe you look at something like the debates on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. The Democrats did lose votes on that, and the squad, you know, some of the folks who are farther to the left in the Democratic caucus, and Republicans, the moderate Republicans did end up supporting that. I think, I don't remember the exact number, but I think it got into the double digits, you know, around 12 or something like that. So, you know, there are opportunities to do that way, right? And you take the far right and say, you know, well, we've got a piece of legislation that moderate Democrats can get on board with, and you cobble together a majority vote that way. So that's one option that he can look at. You know, I'll just throw out Don Bacon, who just won a tough re-election in Nebraska and is a pretty moderate Republican, said, you know, if McCarthy can't seem to get it together to actually win the speakership, maybe they work with Democrats to get a moderate speaker. Now, do I think that's going to happen? Probably not. But that's just my, you know, my point saying that is that when you're dealing with a margin this tight, there are some other ways to work to get the votes, but it's going to have to involve a willingness sometimes to cross party lines and be bipartisan. So then the question is there any interest in that in the Republican caucus, or would they rather just be, you know, we're going to investigate Hunter Biden and we're going to do oversight and we're just going to try as much as possible to stop the Biden agenda? The problem with that is, if that's all you have to deliver for 2024, will voters be satisfied with that? So I think those are a lot of the questions that we have to see how they start to handle it moving forward. And I do agree with Roland. I think Ukraine, I feel pretty okay that funding will continue, and probably just like Roland said, with more accountability on how the money's being spent, conditions, some things like that. And I also agree that the military piece is more likely than the continued, you know, macroeconomic support, or even, you know, what funding might look like
for reconstruction at some point down the road, that might get tougher, and is where you're going to need the European allies to step up. So again, a tight caucus just means the speaker, whoever it is, again, I assume McCarthy. But again, you can look at Pelosi from these last couple of years. It just means it's a really tough job of a lot of negotiating and a lot of understanding what your members want and what they're willing to give and what they're willing to vote for, and doing really, really good vote counting. So whoever wins the whip race will be very important, because they're going to be the ones that say, all right, I know we've got it and we can go forward. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the dynamics evolve.
You asked me, Martin, about whether this midterm result creates opportunities for new cooperation between the United States and U.S. partners and allies that wouldn't have otherwise been there. I don't think it does. I mean, what it does do is it provides a measure of reassurance to U.S. partners that their concerns about the the future of American democracy, which are not imagined. In fact, they've been articulated by Joe Biden and others himself, that those are less immediate, and conversations will be less burdened by those concerns. And Biden himself has said in the last 24 hours, I think, that the outcome of this midterms strengthens America's hand in international affairs. Specifically, he said, because that he has been hearing concerns about U.S. democracy from U.S. allies, and it's a measure of gloating about the problems of U.S. democracy from U.S. adversaries, and so that this reassurance works in all of those ways. I think that the same issues remain the priorities for the U.S. administration, with China and the Indo-Pacific region and Russia, Ukraine looming over absolutely everything. And in ways that I think we're already seeing happening, the United States is taking a kind of entrepreneurial approach to putting together various different kinds of coalitions of countries on a number of different issues. And this is really spelled out quite well in the national security strategy. If folks listening to this conversation haven't taken a look at the U.S. national security strategy, I really recommend it, because it's one of the more coherent strategy documents and interesting to read. And one of the points that it makes, and it really reflects the reality, is that the United States is really approaching a kind of coalitional method, which involves these kind of, assembling different combinations of actors to deal with different issues. Now, we're seeing that extensively in the Indo-Pacific area, but I think that we're going to see that more and more and more globally, especially as the legacy mega multilateral institutions like the UN get increasingly paralyzed by geopolitical competition. So there's lots of opportunity for countries in Europe and for Canada to be not just joining in with American initiatives, but pitching their own initiatives. And this kind of creative multilateralism can actually be very helpful. A lot of times in Canada, we've found that successful initiatives between Canada and the United States, often involving other countries, have been suggested by the Canadian side. Here's something that we could do together that would really make sense. And I think that those kind of opportunities are very much present. Having said all of that, 2024 is still out there looming like Banquo's ghost, and to some extent, it's incumbent on, I hate to say it, but it would be prudent for every single partner of the United States to be hedging against those possible scenarios going forward.
Maybe let's switch. I'll ask first to Roland and then to you, Bailey. Actually two questions that sort of connect on what kind of pressure will the US put on NATO allies to align on its position vis-a-vis China, or at least to sort of reflect on trade ties and supply chains tied to hostile countries such as China. So you mentioned the fact that this is likely to be one of these bipartisan issues where both Republicans and Democrats agree. More concretely, what should we expect from the Biden administration and from Congress on that side? And then a question for you, Bailey, on the future of the GOP. Again, something you mentioned during your presentation on the fact that this was DeSantis' sort of great night, at least in the press, that was often covered that way. What kind of scenarios do you envision? Do you think that Trump still has a grip over the party and its base that sort of protects him in the coming months and years, or is there a real challenge and a potential war within the party looming?
Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know exactly what direction we might see U.S. policy going, and with regard to pressuring allies. We have already talked about the pressure that will continue to be contributing more to the collective effort in Ukraine, but you raised the question about Indo-Pacific. And, the United States clearly sees a role for NATO in the Indo-Pacific, but is not pushing for NATO to be, performing a really significant out-of-area role in the Indo-Pacific. I think that the pressure will come more from, and, the greatest predictor of the future is to look at what the recent behavior has been, will come more from increasing efforts to secure U.S. supply chains and to ensure that China does not have access to advanced U.S. technology in areas where China could potentially exceed U.S. Technological capacities or use those technologies for military or other kinds of nefarious purposes. So I think that the kind of rules regarding technology transfer, rules involving ownership and investment, all of those are very ripe areas for the United States to continue to strengthen its policies. And because, as we've seen, there's likely to be extraterritorial application of these rules, like with U.S. technology, regarding semiconductors, then it's going to have direct implications for U.S. allies. And of course, the way the United States works, this is the kind of fond irritation that those of us who live near the United States have, is that, the United States may, for national security reasons, impose some kind of restriction on U.S. businesses and then turn to U.S. allies and say, we need a fair playing field, so you need to do the same thing. Well, these were your rules to start with. Nevertheless, this is the direction of travel. So the question for U.S. allies is how to get ahead of it. And the way to get ahead of it, as I was kind of hinting at before, with regard to these coalitional approaches to cooperation, is to be proposing our own ideas that are aligned with our interests and with U.S. interests. We all need to be securing our supplies of critical inputs. We all need to be diversifying our suppliers. We all need to be protecting our technologies from theft. And we all share that in common. So putting ideas forward is a great idea. And again, Chrystia Freeland, the Canadian Deputy Prime Minister, former Foreign Minister of Canada, was in Washington a few weeks ago and gave a big speech talking about the importance of friendshoring. She grabbed that language from Janet Yellen, and it was a clear play to say, if you're thinking about protectionism or protectionist measures, then Canada's inside the tent with you. Our critical minerals are vital to your economic security, to our collective economic security. See, that's smart diplomacy. And so managing this is going to be hard, but it's manageable.
Bailey?
All right, on the 2024 question is a tough one. So I think what I'll say, I don't know that there's a war looming, but Republicans do have to answer tough questions about what happened on Tuesday. And look, we don't have all the data we need yet. Maybe, again, the House still hasn't even been called yet, but it was an abnormality for a midterm year. Going into the election, inflation and crime were top of mind for voters. People were very unhappy with President Biden, but Democrats were successful at holding the Senate. They may be picking up a seat depending on what happens in Georgia next month. The House is going to remain very tight, though, like I said, I think Republicans do get that. And then there were a lot of successes for Democrats at the gubernatorial, Secretary of State, and even state legislative level. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, especially among the election deniers at the gubernatorial, Secretary of State level, that just was not something voters bought into in big enough numbers for those people to win. Now, going into 2024, the Republicans do have a much better map in the Senate. So I think the question that they've got to figure out is, does Trump hurt them or help them? I mean, basically since 2016, the answer is hurt. There's not been, 2018 did not go well, 2020 did not go very well, and this last election did not go well. And so, you know, do they think he is going to help them do better in 2024? And then I think the other challenge for them is, like, what is the path for another candidate to come forward who can get a consensus enough to win their nomination? You know, like you look at someone like a Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, who was just term limited, you know, fairly moderate. He was the governor of a blue state for 2 terms. But what's the path for him? You know, what is the actual slice of voters he could win in a Republican primary where he could defeat Trump in a primary? And that's, I think, you know, from Republicans I've talked to and folks, you know, just kind of chatting prior to the elections. And again, this is not the outcome people were expecting going in, you know, even the week into the election. But I think that's the question, is folks just aren't sure, like, what is that path for someone else? With a Ron DeSantis, he's going to occupy a lot of the same voter space as a Donald Trump. But then is he able to, like, get attention outside of the state of Florida? You know, you don't know yet, right? Because he hasn't tried, even though he was very successful. Or are they just going after the same group of voters, and then there's some other candidate who might have a different message? What I will be interested to see tonight, assuming the announcement happens as we're expecting it to, is what is the reaction then? You know, do you actually have leaders in the Republican Party come out and say, nope, not this time, I'm not supporting you, and actually say it, I am not supporting Donald Trump? I don't know if they will. And I think I'm really interested to see, you know, are they going to just say, nope, this is not our guy, we've got to, you know, move forward? I heard that over the weekend on some of the Sunday shows, you know, Republican senators saying we have to move forward, we have to have a narrative that looks to the future, and have a message that inspires people. And so, you know, what do they do if he does end up announcing tonight? I think will be interesting. Or, you know, do they kind of hedge and say, well, you know, we see where this goes? So a lot of uncertainties for where it will head, but it will definitely be interesting to watch.
It will. Thank you. A question for kind of both of you, actually, because I feel that when we talked about Ukraine and the kind of support that the US is likely to continue to give, we envision it as either there is support in the House and in the Senate, and therefore that can continue, or there is a debate. Now, another scenario could be that there is simply utter chaos in the House that will make it for for Congress not to function, not to be able to vote the budget, to lift the debt ceiling, or to provide any kind of substantive aid to Ukraine. Now, how likely is this scenario to take place? That this is not because new congresswomen and men are against Ukraine, but simply because they are unable to produce any sort of compromise and foreign policy. And in this scenario, what would be the consequences for Canada and European allies? I don't know who wants to take it first, but
go ahead, Bailey.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll just say quickly. We do have the lame duck, which Congress is in right now, and I do expect, you know, it's possible they address the debt ceiling and the lame duck, so that doesn't have to become a question next year. We'll see. That's still to be determined. And there is an expectation that more Ukraine aid will be put in the budget that they've got to get done before the end of the year, which could take them through next year. And again, kind of just punt that. The other thing I'll say, and Roland would love your thoughts, but there's also a possibility that if there is chaos, that might be helpful in foreign policy, because if there's a bunch of chaos around the domestic politics and what's going on domestically, that probably does give a little bit more steadiness in the foreign policy realm. So that's one other way to look at it. There is a possibility that the chaos is helpful in charting a steady course in foreign policy.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and in some ways it comes back to Martin's earlier question about, you know, latter part of the Obama presidency and the activism in internet and foreign affairs. And I think it's true, Bailey, that the more paralyzed Biden is on his domestic agenda, the more foreign policy will serve as a vehicle for him to demonstrate that things are getting done. And in the specific areas that we've been talking about, Ukraine and China, even in the chaos scenario, my hunch is that somehow there will be a way to carve out, that there will be a sufficient mutual interest on both sides of the aisle to be able to sustain American support for Ukraine and to move ahead with a more aggressive policy towards China, that those things are going to move forward because there's such shared interest in doing so. So a lot of other areas might be dramatically affected, by a logjam in Congress. You might not be able to visit a U.S. national park for some time, and among other more serious things. But in some ways, I think that those critical issues, are to some extent insulated. Maybe I can just take a moment to comment on another one of the questions. Yeah, because somebody asked about friendshoring, and Germany's, Luciano mentioned Germany's greenlighting of Chinese investment at the port of Hamburg, and a chancellor leading a CEO delegation to Beijing. Would a Republican, I lost the question, but anyway, yeah, I think that this is precisely the kind of thing that might be a lot harder. Because I think that as the U.S. position on Chinese investment continues to harden, there'll be an expectation of compliance, frankly, from a number of U.S. partners, and that will create political pressures and irritation and concerns about extraterritoriality. We all know those dynamics. They will be real. But on the leading of a trade mission, I mean, I'm not sure that it sent the great signal to be leading a trade mission, but fundamentally, the United States is going to keep trading with China. Canada is going to keep trading with China. The EU is going to keep trading with China. We're talking about these areas of a strategic concern. I mean, the United States still wants to sell, its wheat to hungry, hundreds of millions of Chinese. Canada certainly wants to do so. So, we're not talking about decoupling the entire trade relationship. We're talking about areas that could spill over and become a larger trade war. It's a real possibility. But right now, we're not talking about cutting off trade. It ain't Russia.
Thank you. I'll maybe a very last round of questions, actually, for both of you, and then we'll be able to wrap up. For you, Bailey, two quick things. One a bit technical, but I don't know if you have any sense of the implications of the midterms for the House of Representatives democracy partnership. What could happen in this commission and in the chairmanship of the commission. Second question on what happened in the state of New York, because it seems that this is where Democrats have underperformed, and maybe if there is some sort of lessons to be learned also there, that is a bit counterintuitive to what we've already discussed for the rest of the elections. And a question for you, Roland, coming back to what you said before, the fact that after 2024, everything is possible, and allies would be clever to sort of start hedging on different scenarios. Now, even before that, it seems to me that a lot of the discussion that we've been having lies on the idea that US politics is still a rational phenomenon. And that there would still be, rational ideas and debates to be had, so that you could convince U.S. policymakers to go one way or another, and for allies to sort of have a leverage over the future of U.S. foreign policy. Is there still any sort of leverage, in your view, in Ottawa or in Europe, on what US foreign policy will look like in the next 2 years and beyond. Let me start with Bailey, and then I'll turn to Roland.
Sure. I don't actually know on the first question about the House Democracy Partnership. So if you want to, email me after the person that asked that question, I'm happy to try to dig in and find out, but I don't know. State of New York, really interesting question on the state of New York. So I will preface this by saying I have not dug deeply enough into the numbers there on exactly what happened. But what I will say is the gerrymanders in New York and Florida will likely be what was responsible for the Republicans inevitably winning the House, which, like I said, I think they will here whenever, however many more days it takes. The governor's race in New York was closer than it should have been. And so when you look at, what the top of the ticket drives in states, that certainly did not help where Democrats lost in congressional districts in New York. The gerrymander piece of it, the Democrats had tried to do a map that would have been very favorable to them in New York State, and it was thrown out, and they ended up with the maps they ran under, which were much less favorable. That's a piece of it. There may be some piece of quality of candidate at the congressional level in the New York districts, though I'm just less familiar with each of those. So I think those are all pieces of it, though probably a lot more to be said about New York. But again, when you look, even though the governor won, that race ended up closer than I think it probably should have been. And again, you kind of take the flip side of that, like in a Pennsylvania where you had an election denier governor candidate lose and then a not great Senate candidate lose. Well, a lot of the House seats that Republicans had targeted in Pennsylvania, the Democrats won. And again, so some of that may be the top of the ticket helping out lower down races. So my guess is that some of it in New York, then some combination of the gerrymander, and then probably some combination of candidate quality and who ended up running.
Okay, thank you. And Roland, before you answer the last question, there's one more question that appeared in the Q&A. If you could repeat to source your coalition method that you mentioned before.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, first, and remind me if I don't get to the coalition, just give me a quick reminder. I'll try and be quick on this. I think that the question you asked me actually was two questions. One was about rationality, the rationality of the US political system, and then there was a related but somewhat different question about whether US allies have leverage. On the rationality point, if you look at any political system, and you look at the sausage making within the system and you see what comes out of that system, the results are often so idiosyncratic that you can question the rationality of the system. This is the output of political debate and institutional politics and the like. There is the rationality of the individuals, and particularly the rationality of the president. And Donald Trump is distinctly irrational, which was part of the concerns that every country had with him, including US adversaries and US allies, weren't sure what he was going to say or do the next day. But having said that, we, US allies, partners, will need to find a way to work with whoever is in the White House. And then secondly, relatedly, on the question of leverage, well, we have less than we would like to think. The British talk about the special relationship. The French talk about the oldest diplomatic relationship with the United States. Canada is always talking about, friends, neighbors, etc. It would be lovely if the leverage that we had in Washington matched that kind of self-image that we have of ourselves. But here, it also depends on how we're thinking about leverage, because if you're thinking about it in very conventional terms as kind of diplomatic démarche or leader conversations, that's important, but it's far from the only way to gain leverage in Washington or in the US. And this is distinctive to the United States, because the horror and the wonder and beauty of the US political system is that it's a wild carnival, even the best of times, by which I mean there are so many different entry points into the US political system. So the leverage comes from being able to identify interests that are aligned, domestic US interests that are aligned with your own country's interests, and to be able to work in that system at the local, state, national level in Washington, et cetera. So there's the potential for huge leverage, and some countries do that better than others. Finally, on this question about the coalitional approach. I simply mean by that what we're seeing from the United States is the construction of different kinds of groupings of countries. You think about AUKUS, for example, or any number of other groupings that we've seen coming about. And rather, this comes up often in discussions about how will Biden implement his commitment to kind of a democracy agenda? Will there be like a single grouping alliance of democracies? And the answer is no. There won't be one thing. There's going to be different coalitions and alliances on different issues and with different actors. And frankly, it makes more sense for US partners to try to be engaging in these coalitions because that's how to have voice and leverage. And so that's part of the game, I think, that's emerging. And as I said before, being able to propose coalitional arrangements that the US might be interested in to advance US interests that also reflect the interests of US partners is a good strategy.
Thank you very much to both of you. I think at GMF, we sort of proud ourselves that we end on time. So it's 6:01, I mean, almost there. But thank you so much, Roland and Bailey, for agreeing to participate in this fascinating conversation. Thank you to all for attending this webinar today. Thank you to the Canadian Embassy again for the support. And we will continue, obviously, to work on these issues as part of GMF. So you will hear from us very soon. Have a good day. Bye-bye.